So following the Battle of Orleans, where Joan led the French army in a decisive victory over the English, the Dauphin, or prince, was crowned king at Rheims, where Joan stood proudly, there's Joan, proudly by his side. When asked later by her trial inquisitors, why was your flag carried in the church more than any other captain's, she answered simply, as it had borne the burden, it was quite right that it received the honor. I spent the summer getting to know and falling in love with Joan in preparation for this keynote, and I was sitting at a cottage reading her trial notes, sort of half distracted by, the wind in the trees and the water lapping the shore, when that line silenced the world around me. She essentially says to her accusers, because I did the work, I am worthy of the recognition, the reward. Now imagine the audacity of a girl in medieval France where women did not claim agency or any type of authority. And yet, there is Joan, who had done the work and claimed her worth. Now imagine where we would be if this one lesson had been learned and celebrated from Joan of Arc. Worth is unapologetically claimed. Joan was born a peasant girl in 1412 on a small farm in a rural village on the eastern frontier of the Kingdom of France. She was born into a hyper-patriarchal society based on class and power. Children and women really did not exist outside their fathers' or their husbands' homes. Now, this was a society fine-tuned in layers and layers of hierarchy, and wherever you were determined how many people were above you and who could essentially make your life miserable, so sort of like today's organizational charts. Now, there is more written about Joan in history than most people, and yet she remains so enigmatic because it's not the what that is mysterious, it's the how. Because on the surface, there should have been no chance whatsoever that a young peasant girl, dressed as a man, could lead an army with such precision that she would turn the 100 Years' War in France's favor and ultimate victory over England. She belonged to the wrong gender, the wrong social class, and the wrong age to achieve what she dreamed of. And yet she did. How she did it is a story filled with vision, courage, and betrayal, which spanned more than a half of a century and another 600 years for her to be canonized and reconciled from heretic and witch to blessed, venerated, and finally saint. Now, that's a long time to wait for reconciliation. But what if we were to tell the truth of women's stories and claim the power and pathway that Joan and other women have opened for us? I believe we could build upon their powerful contributions and apply their principles of transformation now and in the future so we could access the full spectrum of human potential and each of us step into our own radical personhood. I think we would all agree that Joan's story is a radical hero story, one where she goes outside into the world and also inside into herself to become the person she was meant to be. So let's talk about how she found the courage to step into her own radical personhood. Now, Joan had a fairly common peasant upbringing, learning to spin wool with her mother, minding the flock with her father, and enjoying the lush pastures with her brothers and sister. What was uncommon was Joan's extremely high intelligence, which manifested itself at a very early age. Now, books or teachers were required for literacy, and Joan had access to neither. So her talent came out of her instinctive perception of the world around her. Late in childhood, with the dangerous conflict swirling around her, Joan began to develop a deep sense of spirituality through her Catholic faith. Simply, she just found comfort in meditation, prayer, and reflection. When she was 13, she claimed the Archangel Michael appeared to her and told her that no knight, nor king, nor general could save France. No one except her. From her own testimony, she says, "The voice told me twice or thrice a week that I, Joan, must go away, that I should raise a siege to the city of Orleans. And me, I answered that I was a poor girl who knew not how to ride or lead in war." Often, when the call is given, the future hero refuses to heed it. Call it fear, or a sense of inadequacy, or in today's term, we call it imposter syndrome. Whatever it was, Joan wrestled with it for 3 years until she acknowledged us. So for those of us who don't believe in angels or saints, or any of the mysticism that is so richly entwined with Joan's story, let's just call her angelic voices intuition, or inner knowing, or as Joan actually called it herself, she said, my counsel. So from her own admission, Joan had become adept at listening to her own counsel from within. So the first pathway Joan opens for us on a journey to radical personhood is learning to shut off the voices of self-doubt from within and to trust our own counsel. Believing in her own counsel, she made the decision to step into herself, into her personhood. She took off one garment, that of the peasant girl, and put on, which no longer served her, and put on another, the armor and clothes of a man. Now imagine how strong of a person you become when you trust yourself and your inner counsel, and you step into it and embody it. I mean, we do that in some way today, call it putting on a power suit, or dressing for the job you want. Now, it may have been easier for Joan to claim this vision of herself because there was this prophecy floating around in France. It was well known across the country that a young girl, a maid or a virgin, would come, would carry arms, and would free the kingdom of France from its enemies and crown the king. So this prophecy actually acted like a want ad. Position for mystic open in the royal court. Qualified candidates apply at your local church. A French historian reported it in the year 1428 alone, when Joan was 16 and already on her way to meet the prince. Some 20 people, most of them women, publicly claimed to have been chosen by God to deliver a message to the king. And this was just a number of recorded instances. So what made Joan so special? Was she really chosen by God? Was she the woman prophesied to save France? Was she a great mystic? Or did she just do what most people don't? She believed in herself, and she aligned her actions with what she believed and followed through. As she testified, I believed it, and I had the will to believe it. Joan's pathway to radical personhood shows us that it takes commitment and aligning our actions to our beliefs about ourselves. Was this unusual in her time? Yes, this was totally radical to claim any agency in a system fully flanked in hierarchy, and frankly, it is still radical today. So Joan's first victory was actually relatively minor, but wildly strategic, because she used this minor victory to shift the mindset of the French army and ultimately shift the military equation in France's favor. Now, up until her arrival, the French were despondent. Their military campaigns had been complete disasters. But she continued to lead the troops in a series of minor victories that restored their confidence and reinforced a mindset so they could eventually take on and succeed in a larger battle. Brilliant. Untrained and unschooled, she bested nobles and military commanders in her approach to the Battle of Orleans, which, after being stalemated for 6 months, finished in 4 days. So if you want a job done, we know, just give it to a woman, right? The French commander, many, many years later, reflecting on Joan, noted, her contribution was that she roused the fighting spirits of the French, which had lain dormant for so long, and this contribution was decisive. Don't take this to mean that Joan was a mascot. She was much more than that. She was a leader whose charisma captured the popular imagination, rallied the troops, and terrified her competition. She was genuinely in the front lines, leading her troops on horseback with a lance. She was followed because of what she believed to be true about herself and because of what she was capable of. After her victory at Orleans, Joan led a series of battles en route to Rheims where Charles VII was crowned king, and she held her flag high. When challenged on why she proudly waved her flag, she reminded the accusers that she did the work and she deserved the reward. So we'd like to think that Joan would have been promoted if she was in our organization in the 21st century. But then, as now, we have a practice of not recognizing certain types of accomplishment because of the person who does it. Joan nonetheless claimed her personhood and worth. course, knowing and claiming her worth really pissed some people off, namely the English, who had lost arms, men, and most importantly, let's be honest, they lost faith. Up until Joan, a young woman, they had basically steamrolled France. So from mocking Joan, the English now feared her, believing her to be a witch. How else could a teenage girl defeat the glorious English army? And this is where the narrative is actually so astounding, because in life she was revered by the French, believed to be sent by God, the woman of the prophecy. To the English, this same woman was in consort with the devil, a witch wielding demons in battle. Joan just couldn't win. And once captured, the English knew they had to take her down where she was most vulnerable, by discrediting her extraordinary achievements, resulting in her personhood being taken away. Hell hath no fury like the English army scorned by a woman. One of the main crimes her persecutors pursued is that by claiming to have some direct connection with her inner council, she was bypassing church hierarchy and undermining the very basis of authority of the ruling class. Because she trusted her own counsel, she went over their heads. And that could not be tolerated. It's like she got direction from the CEO when her manager said, "How dare you talk to the power broker?" The fundamental issue was that she was willing to do the radical thing and trust her own judgment rather than do what other people told her to do. A second apparent crime was her male attire. During her trial, her accusers were fixated on her choice of clothing. Has much changed for women in public life since the 15th century? I'm not sure. But her choice to cut her hair and wear men's clothing was the announcement, essentially, of her refusal to abide by medieval expectations for women and to choose to be her own person instead. So as we know, Joan died a villain, a heretic. The English ran an unfair ecclesiastic trial, found her guilty of 12 counts of heresy, and burned her as a witch. 20 years later, after the French had driven the English finally out of France, King Charles VII had her heresy verdict overturned. She was venerated, returned to the status of mystic and blessed by God. So the English would have you believe that Joan was, this is a quote, "a pernicious temptress, presumptuous, credulous, a false prophetess, a blasphemer, seditious, schismatic, only able to achieve victory in consort with the devil." The French would have you believe that she was touched by God, separate and above the rest of us, exalted, only able to achieve what she did through divine grace and intervention. Modern historians, psychologists, and even neuroscientists have weighed in on Joan's legacy and totally pathologized her. They would have you believe that Joan likely suffered from epileptic hallucinations, was schizophrenic, bipolar, suffered from bovine tuberculosis, Meniere's disease, and most people just think she was actually crazy. None of them would allow you to see Joan as a person. None of them would allow us to see a brilliant, charismatic, young girl who had the presence of mind and strength of will to listen to her inner counsel and to take action, and to do that, win a war that was unwinnable. Now, what if that had been the story? What if we were to tell the truth and claim the power and pathway that Joan has opened for us? When we see Joan not as a witch or a heretic or a psychosis, but as an accomplished person, she gives us permission to step into our own radical personhood. Maybe like Joan, you have a desire to do something entirely unconventional, and you think, oh, if I give voice to this, people in the boardroom will think I'm crazy. Joan's journey to radical personhood shows us that no, it doesn't sound crazy. It sounds like you found the person you want to be or the thing you want to do. By finding the courage to listen to our own counsel from within, aligning our actions with what we believe about ourselves to be true, doing the work, and claiming the worth, we can access the full spectrum of human potential so we can all step into our own radical personhood, as Joan did 600 years ago. Thank you.